It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon. The sky was blue, the birds were chirping, and Jake Miller was just chilling at home. His house was small, nothing fancy, with a little porch out front and a patchy lawn that needed some love. Jake liked it that way, simple and quiet. He sat on his porch in an old rocking chair, sipping a glass of lemonade. The cool drink felt good in the warm sun, and he watched the world go by with a tiny smile on his face. To everyone in his small town, Jake was just the quiet guy. You know the type, the person who doesn't talk much, doesn't cause trouble, and just blends into the background. He wasn't loud like some people. He didn't throw big parties or drive a shiny car that made everyone turn their heads. Nope, Jake drove an old beat-up truck. It was rusty around the edges, with chipped paint and a loud engine that grumbled every time he started it. The truck looked like it might fall apart any day, but Jake didn't seem to care. He'd just hop in, turn the key, and drive off with that same little smile. Jake wore plain clothes, too. Nothing special, just jeans that were a little faded and t-shirts that looked soft from being washed so many times. Sometimes he'd toss on a baseball cap, pulling it low over his eyes so you couldn't see much of his face. If you passed him on the street, you might not even notice him. That's how quiet he was. Neighbors would wave, and he'd wave back, but he never stopped to chat for long. "Hey, Jake," they'd call. "Hey," he'd say back, nodding once before heading on his way. Everyone thought they had Jake figured out. To them, he was just the guy who lived alone, kept to himself, and didn't make a fuss. Kids in the neighborhood didn't knock on his door asking to play. Grown ups didn't invite him over for dinner. He was like a shadow there, but not really part of things. Some people even whispered about him when he wasn't around. "That Jake," they'd say, shaking their heads. "He's nice enough, but kinda boring. Doesn't do much, does he?" Oh, how wrong they were. So wrong. Because here's the thing, and listen close, because this is where it gets good. Nobody knew the real Jake. Not his neighbors, not the lady at the grocery store who rang up his bread and milk, not even the mailman who dropped letters in his rusty mailbox every day. Jake wasn't boring at all. Behind that calm smile, behind those plain clothes and that creaky old truck, he was hiding something big. Something huge. Something that would soon turn his whole neighborhood upside down and make everyone's jaws drop to the ground. Let's rewind a bit and picture that Saturday afternoon again. The sun was high, making everything look golden and warm. Kids were riding bikes down the street, their laughter bouncing off the houses. A dog barked somewhere nearby, and the smell of someone grilling burgers floated through the air. It was the kind of day where nothing big was supposed to happen, just a normal, lazy weekend. Jake sat there on his porch, rocking back and forth in his chair. His lemonade glass was sweating in his hand, little drops of water sliding down the side. He looked so relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. But if you looked closer, really close, you might have noticed something. Jake's eyes weren't lazy or sleepy like you'd expect. They were sharp. They darted around, watching everything. The kids on their bikes, the cars rolling by, the birds hopping in the grass, he saw it all. His smile stayed soft, but those eyes? They were alive, like he was waiting for something. Like he knew something nobody else did. And he did. Oh, he definitely did. See, Jake wasn't just chilling that day for no reason. He wasn't sitting there because he had nothing better to do. He was watching, waiting, and keeping his secret close. That old truck parked in his driveway. It wasn't just some junky ride he couldn't afford to replace. Those plain clothes? They weren't just what he threw on because he didn't care. Everything about Jake, the way he acted, the way he looked, was part of a plan. A big, sneaky plan that nobody saw coming. Let's talk about his neighbors for a second. Across the street lived Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They were older, with gray hair and a little dog that yapped at everything. They'd wave at Jake sometimes, but mostly they ignored him. "He's a nice boy," Mrs. Thompson would say, watering her flowers. "But so quiet. Doesn't have much to say, does he?" Next door was Karen Baxter, the loudest lady on the block. Karen was the kind of person who thought she ran the whole neighborhood. She'd yell at kids for kicking balls too close to her yard, and she'd bang on doors if someone parked in her spot even though it wasn't really hers. Karen didn't like Jake much. "That truck of his is an eyesore," she'd grumble. "He ought to get rid of it." Then there were the kids. A group of them hung out on the corner, riding bikes and eating candy from the gas station. They'd zoom past Jake's house, giggling and shouting, but they never stopped to talk to him. To them, he was just the quiet man with the ugly truck. "He's kinda weird," one kid said once, chewing on a gummy worm. "Doesn't he ever do anything fun?" Nope, they didn't get Jake either. Nobody did. But that's what made Jake so smart. He let them think he was boring. He let them think he was just some guy who didn't matter. He didn't argue, didn't brag, didn't show off. He just smiled that little smile and kept his secret tucked away, like a treasure he wasn't ready to share yet. And what was that secret? Well, I can't tell you everything right now, that'd ruin the fun. But I'll give you a hint. It had something to do with that truck, something to do with why he was so calm, and something to do with why Karen Baxter was about to have the worst day of her life. Picture this, Jake sitting there, rocking in his chair, the lemonade cold in his hand. The sun was starting to dip a little lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. It was peaceful, quiet, normal. But inside Jake's head, things weren't quiet at all. He was thinking, planning, waiting. He knew something was coming, something big. And when it hit, it wouldn't just surprise his neighbors. It'd flip everything they thought they knew about him right upside down. Let's zoom in on that truck for a minute. It was parked in Jake's driveway, same as always. The paint was peeling, the tires looked worn, and one of the windows was cracked. If you saw it, you'd think, man, that thing's a mess. Kids laughed at it sometimes. Karen rolled her eyes every time she walked by. But Jake didn't mind. He'd pat the hood like it was an old friend, climb in, and drive off without a word. Why didn't he care? Why didn't he get a new car? Because that truck wasn't what it seemed. It was part of his secret, a secret so cool, so wild, that it'd make everyone wish they'd been nicer to Jake all along. Back to that Saturday afternoon. The kids on their bikes were slowing down, getting tired from riding in circles. The dog across the street stopped barking, curling up on the porch. The smell of burgers faded as the grill cooled off. Everything was winding down, getting ready for evening. Jake took another sip of his lemonade, the ice clinking in the glass. He looked so normal, so boring, so quiet. But inside, he was buzzing. He knew the calm wouldn't last. He knew something was about to happen, something that'd make the whole neighborhood talk for weeks. And here's where I'll leave you hanging, just for a bit. Jake Miller wasn't who they thought he was. That quiet guy with the old truck and the plain clothes. He was hiding something huge, something that'd shake up his little town and teach a certain loud neighbor a lesson she'd never forget. What was it? How would it all go down? You'll have to stick around to find out, because this story's just getting started, and trust me, it's gonna be a wild ride. Now, let's meet Karen Baxter. She was Jake Miller's next-door neighbor, and boy, was she a handful. Karen wasn't quiet like Jake. Oh no, she was loud, really loud. She was the kind of person who acted like she owned the whole street. Not just her house, not just her yard, but every inch of the neighborhood. If something wasn't the way she liked it, you'd hear about it. Everyone on the block knew Karen because she made sure they did. Karen had short, curly hair that bounced when she walked, and she always wore bright clothes like neon pink shirts or yellow pants that made her stand out. She'd march around with her head high, her voice booming, telling people what to do. She didn't ask nicely. She didn't say please. She just demanded things, like she was the boss of everyone. And most people just sighed and let her have her way because it was easier than arguing. For example, there were kids who liked to ride their bikes up and down the street. They'd laugh and race each other, their tires humming on the pavement. It was fun until Karen came out. "Hey," she'd yell, standing on her porch with her hands on her hips. "You're riding too loud. Slow down or I'll call your parents." The kids would groan, pedaling away slower, wondering how bikes could even be too loud. But that was Karen. She found something to complain about every single day. Then there was the time with the leaves. It was fall, and the trees were dropping their leaves all over the place. They'd blow around in the wind, landing in piles on the grass. Most people thought it was pretty, red, orange, and yellow leaves everywhere. Not Karen. She'd stomp outside with a rake, muttering, "These leaves are a mess. They're ruining my yard." One day, she even banged on Jake's door. "Jake," she shouted. Your tree is dropping leaves in my yard. Trim it, it looks messy from my window. Jake opened the door, looked at her, and just nodded politely. Okay, Karen, he said, his voice soft. But if you looked close, you could see a little spark in his eyes. A tiny glint that said he wasn't as weak as she thought. See, Karen thought Jake was a pushover. To her, he was just the quiet guy with the junky truck who never fought back. She'd boss him around like she did everyone else, and he'd just nod or say a few words. But that spark in his eyes? That was a clue. Jake wasn't scared of Karen. He wasn't weak. He was patient, super patient, and he was watching her, waiting for something. Karen didn't notice that spark, though. She was too busy yelling and stomping around. So, one day, something big happened. It started like any other day. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Jake's old beat-up truck was parked in his driveway. That truck was rusty, with scratched paint and a dent on the side. It wasn't pretty, but it was Jake's, and he didn't seem to mind how it looked. Karen, though. She hated that truck. Every time she saw it, she'd frown and shake her head. What an eyesore, she'd say under her breath. She thought Jake should be ashamed of it. That morning, Karen was in a bad mood. Her son, Tommy, had called her. Tommy was a grown-up, but he still acted like a kid sometimes. Mom, he whined over the phone. My car broke down. I need a ride, and I'm stuck. Karen huffed. Fine, she said. I'll figure something out. She hung up and looked out her window. That's when she saw Jake's truck, sitting there in the driveway, looking old and useless to her. An idea popped into her head. Not a nice idea, but a Karen idea. She marched right out of her house, her flip-flops slapping the ground with every step. She crossed the yard, went up to Jake's door, and started banging on it. Bang. 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 Jake, she shouted, her voice loud enough to wake the whole street. Open this door right now. Jake was inside, probably eating breakfast or reading the paper. He heard the banging and the yelling, but he didn't rush. He walked to the door slowly, opened it, and looked at Karen with his usual calm face. What's up, Karen? He asked, like nothing was wrong. Karen didn't waste a second. I need your spare car keys, she barked, pointing at his truck. My son's car broke down, and he needs help. Your truck looks like junk anyway, you don't even need it. Hand over the keys. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for him to obey her. In her mind, Jake was supposed to say, oh, sure, Karen, and give her what she wanted. That's how it worked with everyone else. But not this time. Jake just stared at her. He didn't yell back. He didn't frown. He didn't even move much. He just looked at her with those sharp, quiet eyes and said, no, Karen. That was it. 2 little words, soft and simple. No, Karen. Her face turned red, bright red, like a tomato. She wasn't used to hearing no, she wasn't used to people standing up to her, especially not quiet Jake. For a second, she didn't know what to say. She just blinked at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then she exploded. What do you mean, no, she yelled. You can't say no to me. I need those keys. My son is stuck, and you're being selfish. That truck's a piece of trash, you don't even use it half the time. She kept going, waving her arms and getting louder. You're going to regret this, Jake Miller. You'll wish you'd helped me. Jake didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just stood there, calm as ever, that little spark in his eyes growing a tiny bit brighter. No, Karen, he said again, then shut the door. Not hard, just a gentle click. Karen stood on his porch, fuming. Her hands were balled into fists, and her face was so red it looked like it might pop. Fine, she snapped, even though he couldn't hear her anymore. You'll see. This isn't over. She stomped off, her flip-flops slapping louder than ever. She was mad, really mad. She didn't like losing, and to her, Jake saying no was like a big fat loss. Oh, but she had no idea what was coming. No clue at all. Back inside, Jake walked to his window and peeked out. He watched Karen storm across the yard, muttering to herself. That little smile was still on his face, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He was ready. Karen thought she'd won by yelling and making a scene, but she didn't know she'd just started something big. Something that'd turn everything upside down. The next day, Karen didn't let it go. She stood in her yard, glaring at Jake's house like it had personally insulted her. She told the neighbors her version of the story. "Can you believe Jake?" she said to Mrs. Thompson, who was watering her flowers. "I asked for his spare keys just to help my son and he said no. So rude." Mrs. Thompson nodded, not really listening. Karen kept going, telling anyone who'd listen how selfish Jake was. "He's got that ugly truck just sitting there," she complained. "What's he even needed for?" But Jake? He didn't say a word. He went about his day like nothing happened. He mowed his lawn, watered his plants, and waved at the kids riding by. He didn't tell his side of the story. He didn't need to. That spark in his eyes said he had a plan, a secret plan, and Karen's yelling was just the beginning. She thought she was in charge, but she was wrong. Jake wasn't weak. He wasn't a pushover. He was waiting, and soon, she'd find out why. The tension was building, like a storm cloud, getting darker and darker. Karen kept pushing, thinking she could boss Jake around. Jake kept watching, staying calm and quiet. The neighbors didn't know who to believe, but they could feel something coming. Something big. And oh, it was going to be good. Karen had no idea what she'd started, but she was about to find out the hard way. After that big fight about the car keys, Karen Baxter wouldn't let it go. Not even a little bit. She was like a dog with a bone, she just kept chewing on it, day after day. Every time Jake stepped outside his house, there she was, glaring at him. Her eyes were narrow and mean, like she was trying to burn a hole right through him. If he went to get his mail, she'd stand in her yard, arms crossed, staring. If he watered his plants, she'd peek over the fence, frowning hard. She didn't say much at first, just glared, but you could tell she was mad. Really mad. Karen didn't stop with the glares, though. Oh no, she took it further. She started talking to the neighbors, telling them all about Jake and how awful she thought he was. "Can you believe him?" she'd say, her voice loud and whiny. "I asked for his spare keys just to help my son and he said no. He's so selfish." She'd catch Mrs. Thompson watering her flowers and lean over the fence. "Jake's rude, isn't he? Won't even help a neighbor in need." Mrs. Thompson would nod a little, not really caring, but Karen kept going anyway. She told the mailman, the kids on their bikes, even the guy who mowed lawns down the street. "Jake Miller is selfish and rude," she'd say, shaking her head like it was the worst thing ever. The neighbors started whispering about it. "Did you hear about Jake and Karen?" they'd ask each other. Some thought Karen was right, maybe Jake was mean for not sharing his keys. Others just shrugged. "He's quiet," they'd say. "Doesn't bother anyone." But Karen's words were like little seeds, planting doubts about Jake in people's minds. She wanted everyone to think he was the bad guy, and she was good at making a fuss. Really good. But here's the thing, Jake didn't fight back. Not even a tiny bit. He didn't yell at Karen. He didn't tell the neighbors his side of the story. He didn't even look mad. Instead, he'd just sit on his porch, sipping coffee from a plain white mug. The sun would shine down, the birds would chirp, and Jake would rock in his old chair, calm as ever. Karen would rant and stomp around her yard, loud enough for everyone to hear, and Jake? He'd just watch. His eyes were sharp, like he was studying her, but his face stayed soft with that little smile. It was like he knew something she didn't, like he had a secret up his sleeve, waiting for the right time to show it. Days went by like this. Karen kept glaring and talking, and Jake kept sitting and watching. The neighbors started to wonder what was going on. "Why doesn't he say something?" one kid asked, licking a popsicle. "She's so loud, and he's so quiet." Another kid shrugged. "Maybe he's scared of her." But Jake wasn't scared. Not even close. He was patient, like a cat waiting by a mouse hole. He didn't need to yell or argue, not yet. He had a plan, and Karen was walking right into it without even knowing. Then, one morning, something strange happened. Jake's truck, the old, beat-up one with the rusty sides and chipped paint, was gone. It wasn't in his driveway where it always sat. Karen woke up, looked out her window, and saw the empty spot. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Ha," she said to herself, sipping her tea. He finally gave up. Took that junk heap away. Good riddance. She felt like she'd won. In her mind, Jake must have been so ashamed after her yelling that he got rid of the truck. She puffed out her chest, proud of herself, and went outside to water her roses, still smirking. But Karen's victory didn't last long. Not long at all. Later that day, around lunchtime, something rolled into Jake's driveway. It wasn't the rusty truck. Oh no, it was a shiny black SUV. Brand new, with sleek sides and big, clean tires that gleamed in the sun. The engine purred softly as it stopped, not loud and grumbly like the old truck. The windows were dark, so you couldn't see inside, and the whole thing looked fancy like something a movie star might drive. Jake stepped out of it, wearing his usual plain jeans and t-shirt, that little smile still on his face. Karen was in her yard, holding her watering can, when she saw it. Her jaw dropped. Literally dropped, like in a cartoon. The watering can slipped a little in her hands, splashing water on her flip-flops, but she didn't even notice. "Where'd he get that?" she muttered, her voice low and shaky. She stared at the SUV, then at Jake, then back at the SUV. Her brain couldn't figure it out. Jake. Quiet, boring Jake with the junky truck. Driving that? It didn't make sense to her. Not one bit. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't wave or explain. He just locked the SUV with a little beep from his keys and walked into his house, calm as ever. Karen stood there, frozen, water dripping from her can onto the grass. Her smirk was gone. Her proud feeling? Gone too. Now she was confused and a little mad. "He's hiding something," she whispered to herself. "That's not right. Where'd he get that fancy car?" She didn't know it yet, but Jake wasn't just some quiet guy with an old truck. He was something more, something big, and he was waiting for the perfect moment to show her up. The neighbors noticed the SUV too. The kids stopped riding their bikes and stared. "Whoa," one yelled. "Look at Jake's new ride." Mrs. Thompson peeked over her fence, her eyes wide. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Didn't know Jake had money for that." Even the mailman slowed down as he passed, whistling. "Nice wheels," he called. Everyone was talking about it now, not Karen's complaints, but Jake's shiny new car. The whispers about him being selfish and rude started to fade. People were curious. What was Jake's deal? Karen didn't like that. Not one bit. She wanted everyone to talk about her story, how Jake was mean and wouldn't help her son. But now they were talking about Jake's SUV, and she felt like she was losing control. So she marched over to Mrs. Thompson again. "That car's probably stolen," she said, her voice loud. "He's sneaky, that Jake. Can't trust him." Mrs. Thompson just smiled a little. "Maybe he's not who we thought," she said, and went back to her flowers. Karen huffed, stomping back to her house. She wasn't done yet. The next day, Jake was back on his porch, sipping coffee again. The shiny SUV sat in his driveway, sparkling in the sun. Karen glared at it from her window, her mind racing. "He's up to something," she muttered. "I'll figure it out." She didn't know how right she was. Jake was up to something. That truck being gone? The SUV showing up? It wasn't random. It was part of a secret he'd been keeping all along. And every time Karen glared or complained, she was getting closer to finding out what it was. But not in the way she wanted. Jake watched her from his porch, his sharp eyes following her every move. He saw her peek out her window. He heard her grumble to the neighbors. He knew she was mad, and he knew she wouldn't stop. But that was okay. It was all part of the plan. That little spark in his eyes grew brighter every day, like a fire getting ready to roar. He wasn't just sitting there for fun. He was waiting for the perfect moment to drop a big surprise on Karen and everyone else. The tension was growing, like a balloon filling up with air. Karen kept pushing, thinking she could boss Jake around forever. The neighbors kept watching, starting to wonder who Jake really was. And Jake? He kept sipping his coffee, calm and quiet, letting it all build up. Something big was coming, something that'd make Karen wish she'd never banged on his door. She didn't know it yet, but Jake was ready to show her up, and it was going to be awesome. The next afternoon, things got wild. Really wild. Karen Baxter had been mad for days, mad about Jake, mad about his truck, mad about his shiny new SUV, mad about everything. She'd glared at him, talked behind his back, and grumbled to anyone who'd listen. But that afternoon? She lost it. Completely lost it. She couldn't take it anymore, and she decided it was time to make Jake pay for saying no to her. It started like this: the sun was shining, and the street was quiet. Kids were inside eating snacks, and the birds were chirping softly. Jake was on his porch again, sitting in his old rocking chair. This time, he wasn't sipping coffee, he was just relaxing, looking out at the world with that little smile on his face. His shiny black SUV sat in the driveway, sparkling like a prize. Karen saw it from her window, and something snapped inside her. "That's it," she said to herself, slamming her hands on the table. "He's not getting away with this." She stormed out of her house, her flip-flops slapping the ground hard. Her face was red, her eyes were wild, and her curly hair bounced like crazy as she marched across the yard. She didn't knock on Jake's door this time, she banged on it, loud enough to shake the whole house. Bang! 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 "Jake Miller," she screamed, her voice so loud the neighbors peeked out their windows. "Open this door right now. I've had enough of you." Jake didn't jump or run. He just stood up slowly, walked to the door, and opened it. He looked at Karen, calm as ever, his hands in his pockets. "What's wrong, Karen?" he asked, like she wasn't yelling her head off. That made her even madder. "What's wrong?" she shouted. "You know what's wrong. I need those spare keys for your stupid truck, and you won't give them to me. My son still needs a car, and you're being selfish. Give me those keys right now, or I'm calling the cops." She pointed her finger right in his face, shaking with anger. Jake didn't blink. He didn't yell back. He just shrugged his shoulders, super relaxed, and said, "Go ahead." His voice was steady, like he wasn't scared at all. "Call them if you want." Karen's eyes got wide. She wasn't expecting that. She thought he'd argue or beg her not to, but go ahead? That threw her off. For a second, she just stared at him, breathing hard. Then she smirked, like she'd won. "Fine," she snapped. "I will. You'll be sorry." She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and started talking fast. "Yes, hello. I need the police right now. My neighbor's hoarding car keys and won't help me. He's being awful. Hurry." Jake didn't move. He leaned against the door frame, watching her with that same little smile. The spark in his eyes, the one that had been there all along, was brighter now, like he was excited for what was coming. Karen hung up the phone and crossed her arms. "They're on their way," she said, smirking again. "You're in big trouble now, Jake." He just nodded, like he didn't care one bit. "Okay," he said, and stayed right where he was. Minutes later, a police car rolled up the street. Its lights weren't flashing, and the siren wasn't on, but you could tell it was serious. Two officers stepped out, tall guys in blue uniforms with shiny badges on their chests. They walked up to Jake's porch, their boots clicking on the pavement. The whole street was watching now. Mrs. Thompson peeked through her curtains. The kids ran outside, standing on the corner with wide eyes. Even the mailman stopped his truck to see what was happening. It was like a big show, and Karen was the star, or so she thought. Karen ran up to the officers, pointing at Jake like he'd done something terrible. "There he is," she cried, her voice loud and dramatic. "That's Jake Miller. He's hoarding car keys and won't help me. My son's car broke down, and he's got spares he won't share. He's selfish and rude, and you need to do something about it." She waved her arms, making it sound like Jake had robbed a bank or something crazy. The officers listened, their faces serious. One of them scratched his head, looking a little confused. The other turned to Jake. "Sir," he said, "can we see some ID?" Karen smirked again, thinking she'd won for sure. "Ha," she said under her breath. "Now you're done, Jake." She crossed her arms and waited, ready to see him get in trouble. The neighbors leaned closer, holding their breath. What would Jake do? Would he argue? Would he run? No, he didn't do any of that. Jake just smiled a bigger smile this time and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and handed something to the officer. But it wasn't just a driver's license. Oh no, it was way better than that. The officer took it and looked at it. His eyebrows went up, and he smiled a little. Well, he said, handing it to the other officer. Karen frowned. What's going on, she demanded. Arrest him. But then Jake spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm Officer Jake Miller, he said, his voice clear and strong. Undercover Division. He pointed to what he'd handed over, a shiny police badge, gold and bright, with his name on it. That truck? It's for work. The keys? Not your business, Karen. The street went quiet. Super quiet. You could hear a bird chirp a block away, that's how silent it was. Karen's face went white like all the color drained out of it. Her mouth dropped open, and her arms fell to her sides. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. The officers chuckled, actually laughed out loud. Ma'am, one said to Karen, you can't just demand someone's property. That's not how it works. The other nodded. Maybe next time, ask nicely. Officer Miller's got a job to do. Karen didn't move. She was frozen, standing there with her jaw hanging down. The neighbors gasped. He's a cop, one kid whispered. No way. Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands. I knew he was special, she said. The mailman grinned. That's awesome, he called. Everyone was buzzing now, talking and pointing, but Karen? She couldn't say a word. She just stared at Jake, then at the badge, then at the officers, her brain trying to catch up. Jake stood there, still calm, still smiling. He took his badge back from the officer and slipped it into his wallet. Thanks, guys, he said to the cops, like they were old friends. No problem, Jake, one answered. Stay safe out there. They tipped their hats to him, actually tipped their hats, and turned to Karen. Ma'am, don't call us unless it's a real emergency, okay, they said. Then they walked back to their car, laughing a little as they went. The police car drove off, and the street exploded with noise. Kids cheered. Jake's a cop? Jake's a cop, they shouted, jumping up and down. Neighbors clapped and laughed. Wow, he fooled us all, someone said. But Karen? She was still frozen. Her face wasn't red anymore, it was white, then pink, then red again as she realized what just happened. Jake wasn't just some quiet guy. He was an undercover police officer, a real-life hero, and she'd been yelling at him like he was nothing. Jake looked at her, that spark in his eyes shining bright now. He didn't say anything mean. He didn't rub it in her face. He just nodded once, like he was saying, told you so, without words. Then he turned and walked back inside his house, shutting the door with a soft click. Karen stood there, alone on his porch, with everyone watching her. The kids giggled. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. The mailman drove off, still grinning. Karen had wanted Jake in trouble, but now she was the one who looked silly. She finally moved, shuffling back to her house with her head down. Her flip-flops didn't slap anymore, they dragged on the ground. She didn't yell, didn't glare, didn't say a word. She just went inside and shut her door, probably wishing she could disappear. The whole street kept buzzing, talking about Jake and his badge and how cool it was. Karen's big plan had backfired big time, and Jake's secret was out. He wasn't just a quiet guy. He was a cop, and he'd just shown her up in the best way ever. After that wild afternoon with the police, things changed fast. Really fast. Karen Baxter didn't dare bother Jake Miller again, not even a little bit. She'd spent days yelling at him, glaring at him, and telling everyone he was selfish and rude. But now, after finding out he was an undercover cop, she was done. She didn't knock on his door. She didn't stomp over to his yard. She didn't even look at him funny. Karen was quiet for the first time ever, and it was because she'd learned her lesson the hard way. Word spread like wildfire through the small town. By dinner time that day, everyone knew the truth. Quiet Jake wasn't just some boring guy with an old truck. He was a tough undercover cop who'd been keeping the town safe behind the scenes. People couldn't believe it. Jake's a cop, they'd say, their eyes wide. No way. But it was true, and the news zipped from house to house, kid to kid, neighbor to neighbor. By the next morning, it was all anyone could talk about. The neighbors who'd ignored Jake before, well, they didn't ignore him anymore. Mrs. Thompson, the old lady with the little dog, started waving hello every time she saw him. "Good morning, Officer Jake," she'd call from her porch, smiling big. The mailman, who used to just drop letters and go, slowed down his truck to chat. "Hey, Jake," he'd say. "Heard you're a hero. Cool stuff." Even the grown UPS who thought Jake was dull started nodding at him when he walked by. They didn't whisper about him being boring now, they whispered about how awesome he was. The kids. Oh, they loved it most of all. The same kids who'd zoomed past his house on their bikes, not caring who he was, now thought Jake was the coolest guy ever. The day after the big reveal, a few of them knocked on his door. Knock, knock, knock. Jake opened it, and there they were, 3 kids with messy hair and big grins. "Hi, Jake," one said, bouncing on his toes. "Are you really a cop? Like, a real one?" Jake smiled that little smile he always had and nodded. "Yep," he said. "Undercover cop." The kid's eyes got huge. "Whoa," another one shouted. "Have you caught bad guys? Like robbers and stuff?" Jake leaned against the door, thinking for a second. "A few," he said, keeping it simple. Tell us, they begged, jumping up and down. So Jake sat on his porch steps, and the kids plopped down on the grass in front of him. He told them a story, nothing too scary, just a fun one about chasing a guy who stole a big bag of money. The kids listened with their mouths open, giggling and gasping. "Did you catch him?" one asked. "Yep," Jake said. "Locked him up." They cheered like he'd just won a game. From then on, the kids wouldn't leave Jake alone in a good way. Every day after school, a few would ride their bikes to his house. "Jake, got any more stories?" they'd yell. Sometimes he'd sit out there with them, sipping lemonade, telling tales about sneaky bad guys and clever traps. Other times, he'd just wave and say, "Maybe tomorrow." They didn't care, they just liked being around him. To them, Jake wasn't the quiet guy anymore. He was their hero, like a superhero without a cape. And that shiny black SUV in his driveway? People started asking about that too. It wasn't just some random fancy car, it had a story. Turns out, Jake had earned it after busting a big case. A really big one. The neighbors didn't know all the details, Jake didn't brag, but word got around that he'd stopped some bad people from doing something dangerous in the town. The police gave him the SUV as a thank you, a reward for being so brave and smart. That's why he's got it? Mrs. Thompson told the mailman one day. He's a hero, and heroes get cool stuff. The mailman nodded. Makes sense. That truck was for work, but this is his prize. Jake didn't talk about it much. If someone asked, "Hey, Jake, how'd you get that SUV?" he'd just shrug and say, "Work stuff." That was it. He didn't need to show off. He didn't need to tell everyone how great he was. The shiny car, the badge, the way he stayed calm, it all said it for him. People looked at that SUV now and didn't see just a car. They saw proof that Jake was more than they thought, way more. As for Karen, she was a different story. After that day on Jake's porch, when the cops laughed at her and everyone found out the truth, she kept her head down. Way down. No more yelling at kids for riding bikes too loud. No more banging on doors to complain about leaves or trees. No more marching around like she owned the street. Karen was quiet, super quiet, and it was weird for everyone who knew her. She'd leave her house to get the mail or water her roses, but she'd do it fast, looking at the ground, not talking to anyone. The neighbors noticed. "Where's Karen?" one kid asked, licking a popsicle. "She's not yelling anymore." Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "Guess she learned her lesson," she said. "Messed with the wrong guy, didn't she?" The mailman agreed. "Yep. Jake showed her up good. She's not so bossy now." It was true. Karen had thought she could push Jake around, demand his keys, and make him feel small. But she'd picked the wrong person to mess with, and now everyone knew it. One day, a week after the big scene, Karen walked outside to get her newspaper. Jake was on his porch, sipping coffee, the SUV gleaming in the sun. She glanced at him, just a quick look, and he nodded at her. Not a mean nod, not a mad one, just a simple hey. Karen's face turned pink. She grabbed her paper and scurried back inside, not saying a word. Jake didn't laugh or call after her. He didn't need to. His actions, the badge, the cops, the truth had said it all. Karen wasn't in charge anymore, and she knew it. The street felt different now. Better. The kids rode their bikes without worrying about Karen shouting. Mrs. Thompson watered her flowers and waved at Jake every morning. The mailman honked his horn when he passed Jake's house, like a little hello. People smiled more, talked more, and felt safer knowing Jake was around. "He's been watching out for us all along," one neighbor said. "Who knew?" Another nodded. "Quiet guy, big heart. That's Jake." Jake didn't change much, though. He still wore his plain jeans and t-shirts. He still sat on his porch, rocking in his chair. He still drove that old truck sometimes. Yep, it came back a few days later, rusty as ever for work stuff. But now, when he drove the SUV, people didn't stare because it was fancy. They stared because they knew what it meant. Jake was a cop, a hero, and he'd earned every bit of respect he got. Karen stayed out of his way. If she saw him outside, she'd turn around or look busy with something else. She didn't dare ask for anything, not keys, not help, not even a hello. She'd messed up big time, and the whole town saw it. One kid even made a joke: Karen wanted Jake's keys, but she got his badge instead. The other kids laughed, and it spread around like a silly rhyme. Karen didn't think it was funny, but she couldn't argue. It was true. Jake didn't rub it in her face. He didn't have to. He didn't go to her house and say, "See? I'm a cop." He didn't tell the neighbors how dumb she'd been. He just kept being Jake, calm, quiet, and strong. That was enough. His actions, the way he stood up to her, the way he showed his badge, the way he stayed cool, did all the talking. Karen had tried to make him look bad, but she'd made herself look silly instead. Justice was served, and it felt good. The town settled into a happy rhythm after that. Jake's porch became a little hangout spot for the kids, who'd beg for more cop stories. The neighbors started inviting him over. Sometimes Mrs. Thompson even brought him cookies once, saying, "For our hero." Karen stayed quiet, and the street stayed peaceful. Jake had won not by yelling or fighting, but by being himself. And that was the best kind of win there was. So here's the thing, friends: sometimes the people you think are small or weak are actually the strongest ones around. Think about Jake Miller for a minute. He was the quiet guy, right? The one with the rusty truck and plain clothes, the one who didn't talk much or make a fuss. Everyone in his town thought he was just some boring neighbor, someone who didn't matter much. Karen Baxter sure thought so. She looked at him and saw a pushover, someone she could boss around and yell at whenever she wanted. But boy, was she wrong. Jake didn't need to shout or fight to prove he was strong. He didn't need to march around the street like Karen, telling everyone how great he was. Nope, he just waited calm and cool for the truth to come out. He sat on his porch, sipping coffee or lemonade, watching the world with those sharp eyes and that little smile. He knew who he was. He knew he was an undercover cop, a tough guy who'd been keeping the town safe all along. But he didn't brag about it. He didn't tell anyone until he had to. And when he did, wow, it was awesome. That day when Karen called the cops, thinking she'd get Jake in trouble, was the moment everything flipped. Jake didn't argue or run away. He just pulled out his badge and said, "I'm Officer Jake Miller." Boom. Just like that, the truth came out, and everyone saw him for who he really was, a hero. Karen's face went white, the neighbors cheered, and Jake stayed calm, like it was no big deal. That's strength, right there, not loud, not pushy, but steady and sure. Jake didn't have to fight with his fists or his voice. He fought with patience, and he won big time. And Karen? Oh, poor Karen. She learned the hard way that judging people can backfire big time. She thought she knew Jake. She thought he was weak because he was quiet, because he didn't yell back, because he drove an old truck instead of a fancy car. She judged him by how he looked, not who he was inside. And what happened? She made a fool of herself. She banged on his door, demanded his keys, called the cops, and ended up looking silly in front of the whole town. The cops laughed at her, the neighbors stared, and Jake just stood there, letting her see her mistake. That's what happens when you think you're better than someone without really knowing them. Karen's lesson wasn't fun for her, but it's a good one for us. Judging people by what you see on the outside, like their clothes, their car, or how loud they are, can get you in trouble. You might miss the real story. Jake was quiet, but he was strong. He didn't look like a hero, but he was one. Karen didn't see that until it was too late, and by then, everyone else knew it too. She had to keep her head down after that, quiet and embarrassed, while Jake got waves and smiles from the whole street. So what's the big idea here? It's simple: don't judge too fast. The person you think is small might be big inside. The quiet kid in class, the one who doesn't talk much. Maybe they're super smart or really brave, just waiting for the right moment to shine. The neighbor who doesn't show off. Maybe they've got cool secrets, like Jake did. You never know until you give them a chance. Karen didn't give Jake a chance, she just yelled and demanded, and look where it got her. Nowhere good. Jake's way was better. He didn't need to prove anything to Karen or anyone else right away. He waited, stayed calm, and let the truth do the talking. That's real power, not shouting or pushing, but knowing who you are and letting it show when it counts. Jake didn't get mad at Karen, even when she was mean. He didn't call her names or fight back. He just kept being himself, quiet, strong, and smart. And when the time came, he showed his badge, and that was that. No yelling needed. The truth was enough. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever seen someone surprise everyone like Jake did? Maybe a friend who seemed shy but then did something amazing? Like, maybe they stood up to a bully when no one else would, or they won a big race even though they didn't look fast. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you've got something cool inside, something strong or brave that people don't see yet. You don't have to shout it out loud. You can be like Jake and wait for the right moment to let it shine. That's pretty awesome, right? Let's picture Jake one more time. After everything went down, he was still the same guy sitting on his porch, rocking in his chair, sipping his drink. The kids loved him now, asking for stories about catching bad guys. The neighbors waved and smiled, calling him Officer Jake. That shiny SUV sat in his driveway, a prize for his big case, and sometimes he'd drive the old truck too, just for work. He didn't change who he was, he didn't start acting loud or bossy. He stayed quiet, stayed calm, and let his actions tell the story. That's why he won. That's why everyone liked him. Karen, on the other hand, had to learn her lesson the tough way. She thought she could boss Jake around because he didn't fight back at first. She thought quiet meant weak, and she was so wrong. Now she's the one who's quiet, not because she wants to be, but because she knows she can't mess with Jake anymore. She tried to make him look bad, but she made herself look silly instead. That's what happens when you judge too fast and don't think about the other person. Karen's not the hero of the story, Jake is, and she knows it. So here's a little challenge for you: next time you meet someone, don't decide right away if they're cool or not. Don't look at their clothes or their toys or how loud they are and think you know everything. Give them a chance to show you who they really are. Maybe they're like Jake, quiet on the outside, but strong and amazing on the inside. You might be surprised. And if someone tries to boss you around like Karen did to Jake, don't worry. Stay calm, be yourself, and let the truth come out when it's time. It worked for Jake, and it can work for you too. What do you think about all this? Have you ever seen someone surprise everyone like Jake did? Maybe a kid at school, a neighbor, or even someone in your family. I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below. I read every single one, and they make me smile. Did someone you thought was quiet turn out to be super cool? Or maybe you've got a secret talent no one knows about yet. Tell me. I want to know. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild story, friends. It started with Karen banging on Jake's door, demanding his keys, and ended with Jake showing his badge and winning the day. It's been a fun ride full of surprises, lessons, and a big happy ending. I hope you liked it as much as I did. If you did, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next wild story. I've got more coming: crazy neighbors, sneaky secrets, and tons of fun. I'll see you there, okay? Bye for now, and keep being awesome just like Jake.